أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Please recite one more salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Before I begin the topic that we've been talking about, I want to comment on something that I saw in the community that I'd like to appreciate.
نعره حیدری
مدد
This is
بار دیگر صلوات
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So yesterday in the course of the matam, there was a little bit of dynamic because the matam was going on, and then some of the brothers brought out some the chains that in some cultures are used to kind of continue that matam, and I asked that it be stopped, and so the maturity with which the people who were involved dealt with it, I was very, very happy. I was very I wanted to compliment the community on that. So I want to clarify, because, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, because it's a very sensitive kind of a topic that polarizes people sometimes. But again, the people who came to talk to me, they were very level-headed and very kind of rational, and it was very nice to kind of have a discussion about this. So the idea was not that they're doing something wrong, and that's why it had to be stopped, right? It's a symbolic kind of a flagellation with those chains. It's not with blades or anything like that, which is not permissible. It's a symbolic type of a thing. But the reason I asked it to be stopped was because it is a polarizing sort of a thing. Some people feel very passionate about it, and then some people feel very uncomfortable about it. And I would like to encourage you as a community, especially as a kind of a budding community, make sure that you do things that promote the most unity that you can amongst yourselves.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Right, so you focus on those principles, those ideas that are solidly part of the deen, and those things that people are comfortable with, that are solidly part of the deen. I might have certain preferences, personal preferences, right? My personal preferences have no place in communal affairs. Or, for instance, certain cultures might have certain practices, right? Those cultural practices that are for one particular foreign culture, those also don't necessarily have a place in communal affairs in a place like this, where we have such a diversity of foreign cultures that are coming together, and then local American culture from those of us who have been born here, those who are converts, and so forth. So we want to make sure that whatever we do as a community is within the lines of what's Islamic, not simply cultural, and then if it is cultural, then it should be something that's everyone's comfortable with. So, I don't know, for instance, food. Maybe someone has a kind of food that everyone enjoys. It might be it might be an Irani dish or a Lebanese dish, or, good old American food. Everyone loves it though. And so maybe there's one person who has a specialty and they like to make this food and everyone loves it. That's great. That's something that's cultural, but it's also something that everyone loves. But maybe one culture has a food that only certain people like and everyone else has a hard time eating. Maybe it's too spicy, or it has too much of some flavor or that flavor. And certain people like it and certain people don't. That should be avoided in communal affairs. Don't bring that kind of food to the center, because then all of a sudden you're pleasing some people and displeasing others. Right? So that's a trivial example of food, but that goes for everything else as well. Yeah? So make that a kind of a guiding light for you as a community as well. You focus on those things that bring you together, and never bring things into the community that will divide and push people away.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل الفرج.
So today will be the last day that I'm speaking about this topic that I've chosen. Tomorrow we'll focus exclusively on the events of Karbala and kind of going through the story. But today I want to wrap up this topic of decision making from an Islamic perspective. So the last few days, we were applying some of those general principles we talked about in the early days, and we talked about certain kind of critical life decisions, in particular at marriage, at career choices, and then yesterday we looked at place of residence, where you choose to live in your life, and what advice we can glean from Islamic sources to inform our decisions. Today, I want to look at a topic that is also important, not necessarily at that critical level, but it is an important decision that we make in our life, and that is our decisions with regard to vacationing and kind of journeying to different places, and leisure in general. Right, that's part of our daily routine. If you remember the one hadith I shared with you earlier, where the Prophet said that a believer should have 3 times programmed into his daily life, his daily routine. So actually, no, the one that I quoted for you was from Imam Ali from Nahj al-Balagha. للمؤمن 3 ساعات فساعة يناجي فيها ربه وساعة يرم معاشه وساعة يخلي بين نفسه وبين لذتها فيما يحل ويجمل. That a believer should program into his daily routine, his or her daily routine, these 3 different time periods. One is a time for worship, which includes our prayers, reflection, and all of those things that are between us and Allah. And then a second time is the kind of the time that's devoted to making a living, doing all the things that you need to live in the dunya. That's also an important part of our life that we have to take care of. And then the third time that should be programmed is free time. Time to enjoy the halal pleasures of Allah. Right? That's very important. I don't know if that's highlighted enough in our religious context. We usually kind of focus on you have to use your time better, and you have to spend more time worshiping and those kinds of things, which is true. Usually our balance is usually off kilter, where we spend too much time working, right? Or some people have the problem of spending too much time worshiping. That's also a problem, right? That might sound kind of strange, but you can spend too much time worshiping if that is eating into other duties that you have, right? So we want to make sure these things are in balance. So that third one is what I want to focus on today. The leisure time, where we have free time to spare, and now we're going to benefit from the blessings of Allah, take enjoyment. The one qualification that the Imam puts there is that it has to be halal, right? And there's some other hadith that are in a similar tone, and they mention that it's through that third time, the pleasurable time, that we refresh ourselves and gain the strength to be able to do the dunya and the akhirah properly, right? All right.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
One other hadith that's also very beautiful about kind of leisure and playfulness that sometimes we don't highlight enough. Right, we know that the Prophet's a model in every single way, every aspect of his life, and we should understand him in kind of in a very holistic way. Not just focus on certain aspects of the Prophet's life or the Imam's lives, but see them as the holistic guides that they were. There's one hadith from Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
He asks probably his companions, in the context, he says, كيف مداعبة بعضكم بعضا. Muda'aba or mula'aba are 2 words that are used for playfulness, joking around, saying just amusing things that will bring a smile to people's face. So he says, how are you guys in terms of your joking and your playfulness with one another? And so the answer comes qaleel. We don't do much of that, or focus on serious stuff. We don't spend too much time with muda'aba, with playing around. So the Imam says, إِنَّ الْمُدَاعَبَةَ مِنْ حُسْنِ الْخُلْقِ. Being playful, joking around is part of having good akhlaq, having good etiquette, having good character. part of that involves being playful and joking around with people. وَإِنَّكَ لَتُدْخِلُ بِهَا السُّرُورَ عَلَى أَخِيكَ. Through playfulness, you have the opportunity to bring a smile to the lips of your believing brother, your brethren in faith. Right? وَلَقَدْ كَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
وَلَقَدْ كَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ يُدَاعِبُ الرَّجُلِ يُرِيدُ أَن يَسُرَّهُ. And he says, the sixth Imam is saying, it was one of the character traits of the Prophet, one of his habits, that if he wanted to cheer someone up, he would joke around with them, tell them something funny. He saw they're kind of serious, maybe pensive. Just to cheer them up, he would say something and make them smile. Right? So the point then is that leisure, pleasure, these kinds of things are important. They have a place, and we should focus on them and keep them in their place, keep them in balance. We have plenty of guidance also not to go overboard. Like some people are a little too much on that side, where they joke around too much and everything's a joke. That's also not good. If it kind of extends into where your jokes now start to hurt people, your jokes now start to make fun of people, you're now doing ghiba and backbiting and gossiping about people, and that's how you're making jokes, then of course that's evil. You're extending into a realm where it's no longer ma yahillu ma yajmul, like the Imam mentioned. It's no longer halal. So there are certain limits to it, but the basic principle is there. So with regard to our leisure activities, I'm going to give you kind of guidelines. Remember, we want to know the parameters, the law, to make sure that what we do, the activities that we choose, are not outside of the realms of what is lawful. In terms of games, we have a couple of red lines that we can't cross. One that's clear to most people, I think maybe everyone, is that we can't gamble. So any game that involves gambling, betting money, is haram. Not only that, but any game that's strongly associated with gambling is also haram. Right? So even if if you're playing a game that's usually used for gambling, but you're not betting with money. Maybe it's play money or not money at all. You might say, well, we're not actually gambling. We're just playing poker. We're just playing whatever game it is, but we're not actually. There's no money at stake. Even that's haram, because the association there is with gambling. That becomes unlawful. And then one particular game that's singled out for unlawfulness is chess, and that's always a kind of a hard thing for people to understand. But especially Sayyid Sistani comes down hard and says that it's absolutely haram. Some of the other marajah have different opinions about it, so you can check with your own marajah to see what his fatwa is. But Sayyid Sistani anyway says that shatranj, which is chess, is haram. In terms of sports, so sports are also great, highly encouraged. But one of the red lines is again gambling, right? Betting on sports or playing sports that are kind of gambling events, those are also unlawful. In terms of watching sports, one of the red lines we have to watch out for is indecency. So unfortunately, many sports, athletic clothes tend to be quite indecent. And so for instance, watching a sport where the opposite gender is playing and they're dressed indecently, that's not allowed. Right? And that goes both ways, not only one way, but both ways. All right, so those are two kinds of leisure that we partake in. Film and TV, the consideration there is you want to make sure that we abide by the standards of decency. Right, so we don't want to watch anything on TV, on film, that is showing people dressed indecently. By indecently, it doesn't have to be Islamic dress to be decent, but even like the normal streetwear and those kinds of things is fine, but anything more indecent than that, then we have to stay away from that as well. So that restricts us, but it also guides us. Remember, it's always kind of a two-sided, a double-edged sword when we talk about these things. I mentioned this before, I want to reiterate it. If we think of these things as restrictions, that our hands are tied and we can't do this, and Allah tells us we can't do that, and we look at it as a glass empty, half empty, then it feels very negative, right? But if we realize that this is Allah guiding us to what's best and helping us to avoid those things that are harmful that we may not otherwise realize, then we realize the blessing and the guidance, the glass half full perspective of these laws. It's not what we can't do, it's what we're being guided away from for our own best interest, for our own benefit. Another kind of leisure that we can partake in to some extent is music. And there also we have some restrictions, some guidelines to help us to steer away from harmful kinds of music. So with music, let's talk about instrumental music and then singing. So instrumental music, by default, is halal until we establish that it has certain qualities. Right? So the default is that it's halal until we are sure it's haram. That's helpful to know to begin with. What makes music haram and unlawful is if it's music that's in a style that is appropriate for partying, dancing, entertainment in that way, then it becomes haram music. It doesn't matter what the lyrics are. It doesn't matter what the instrument is. If the style is such, so you could, even Sayyid Sistani gives this example. He said, even if you take the Quran, the lyrics of the Quran, and put it into this style of music that would be like, that would be appropriate for being played at a dance club, at a bar, those kinds of places, then that would be haram. That's the Quran. So what about other kinds of lyrics that are talking about other things that are much less than the Quran? Okay, so the style is important, right? The style that's appropriate for those kinds of gatherings, dance clubs, bars, those kinds of places where people are doing haram activities, that kind of music becomes haram as well. And that's going to change, of course, from culture to culture, from time to time. Back in the day, in the 1600s, 1500s, waltzes and a lot of classical music that's very sophisticated now was the party music of the day. So in that day, that day and age, that would have been haram music, right? But now the culture has changed, and that kind of music is no longer party music. Now it's the music of sophistication, and so it's arguably halal now. Singing, which is referred to in Arabic as ghina, is haram as well. So singing is defined again as using your voice, singing words in a style that again is appropriate for those kinds of haram kind of gatherings. So the kind of singing that would take place in a bar, in a club, and those kinds of situations, that kind of singing, that style of singing is haram. Again, even if you put the words of the Quran, the words of a dua, to that kind of tune and sing it, that would become haram too. So it's the style that we're looking at. All right, so that gives some idea of the parameters of what's haram. Everything else is halal. And if you're not sure, you do your best to apply the standards. You can always err on the side of assuming it's halal unless you're certain it fits into one of the categories. That also makes it easier for us to determine. We don't have to take a precaution always. We can, in this case, we can err on the side of assuming that it's halal. Okay, and then one last thing is dancing. So dancing is basically categorically prohibited, right? The only exception, and this differs with different marajah, but Sayyid Sistani's only exception is that a wife can dance for her husband. That's the only exception. And that has to be only with her husband present, so no one else is present. So even women amongst women is not allowed. Men amongst men is not allowed, right? And even a husband for his wife is not allowed, right? So only exception is that one. Okay, so those are some guidelines then with regard to different leisure activities that we might want to partake in. Just make sure that we abide by these red lines and stay away from those red lines. Even in halal leisure activities, though, we want to keep in mind the balance and the moderation that that's ideal in Islam, right? So we can have a halal activity, but as soon as we take it to an excess and we spend all of our time doing that, or we start to eat into the time that we should be spending for other things, then we're not doing the right thing anymore, right? So one thing to keep in mind is to make sure that the activity itself is halal and lawful. But then even if it's lawful, we want to keep it in its own place. Leisure is supposed to be a way to energize ourselves, refresh ourselves, kind of relax, so we can get back to work, so we can get back to worship. Because work and worship, those are the things that we're supposed to be doing. Worship is the true goal, and then work is a necessary thing that we have to do to make sure that we have the livelihood and the health and all that, and the respect and all that, so that we can fully worship Allah the way He's supposed to be worshipped. So to keep everything in balance, keep the hierarchy of priorities also in balance. Okay, that's with regard to leisure. Let me speak a little bit about travel and traveling. So this is also, an Islamic activity. We can. There's Islamic guidance that we can glean from the Quran, from the Ahadith about travel. So we choose our destinations wisely in an Islamic way, and we use our decision-making process to make sure that where we go and what we do on our vacations is also within the guidelines of Islam. So I'll give you a couple of different considerations to keep in mind when you're thinking about travel. One is when you travel, make sure that you travel with an eye to the Islamic calendar and to the Islamic daily schedule. Right? So imagine like if you're taking a vacation and you plan it, and the day you're traveling or the day you're on your itinerary where you're going to have a great time, doing something, it falls on Ashura. Right? Or you're in the middle of your travels and it happens to be Eid because you're applying it for this Christmas holidays or this holiday or that holiday. You didn't pay attention to the Islamic calendar, and it ends up conflicting with some important dates on the Islamic calendar. Right, so we want to be conscious of that. So just as careful as we are with the Gregorian calendar that we plan around our vacations and our school vacations and stuff like that, let's also look towards the Islamic calendar and plan our events so that they mesh with the Islamic seasons as well. And then the prayer times, right? So it is true, and you can pray with a lot of difficulty. You can pray like on a plane, for instance, but it's very hard. Especially nowadays with all the new restrictions and the new kind of atmosphere of anti-Islamic sentiment, it's very challenging and it's very uncomfortable to do it. But you can and you must. If you're in that situation, then you have to take care of your prayers. You can't delay it because of what will people think. But it's even better if you can go ahead and plan your travel so that you're at the airport when it's prayer time. You can pray at the airport or at home before you leave. Right? So plan your journey in such a way where you keep these things in mind, and they're not kind of afterthoughts. Oh, I'm stuck. Now I realize it's prayer time and I can't do anything about it. Another piece of Islamic guidance that we have is before you travel, one of the things that's highly recommended to do is to give sadaqah. We talked about that earlier as well. We talked about bada and how we have control over our fate and our destiny. Allah decides, but He programs it in such a way that we can change what He's decided. That white erase board image that I gave you, and Lawh al-Mahwi wal-Ithbat, where Allah writes in a tentative way our fate, He might have written some hardship, especially in travels. Right? That's one of the times when He tries us a lot. A lot of things are kind of helter-skelter, kind of out of our control in an even kind of magnified level compared to our regular lives. And so one of the things that's recommended to do is to give sadaqah, charity, and that can be a small amount. It doesn't have to be some huge amount, even dollars and think something on that order. But give charity so that you can deflect some of the hardship that otherwise would befall you. There are also supplications to recite. Right? Mafatihul Jinan is a great resource. If you're not familiar with it already, then you should become familiar with it. I've heard rumors that there's a translation that will be coming out in the near future by one of our good translators. So inshallah it'll be even more accessible in the English language. But in the beginning of the ziyarah section, there are a couple of sections on travel. There's some du'as, there's some prayers and different recommendations to do. So that's one of the things you can try to incorporate in your travels. Again, so you're not it's not just a worldly experience, but now you can also make your travels into something spiritual. Another consideration is to think about the people you're going to be traveling with. Yesterday I read that hadith from Luqman, where he said, "At-tariq, al-rafiq, thumma at-tariq." Right? Think about your companions first. First choose who you're going to travel with, and then you decide your itinerary and your destination. Right? It's so much more important for your well-being, your spiritual well-being, especially who you're going to travel with. Are they going to be people that will help you to remember Allah as you're traveling? People who will keep you on track in terms of your prayers and doing the right thing, staying away from harm and evil? Or will they encourage you to do things that are wrong? Will they encourage you to get distracted from prayer? And so that's very critical. So you choose your travel partners first, and then you choose your itinerary. Then think of the purpose itself of your travel. Right? The reason why you're traveling, that's also very important. So you can have some insight and there's some wisdom in what you're doing. It could just be for pleasure. Right? Sometimes you just take a vacation just for pleasure because you want to get away from things, and that's perfectly fine as long as we're away from the red lines of what's unlawful. We want to stay within what's lawful, and then even just pleasure is fine. But there are more meaningful ways that we can, reasons why we can travel as well. Right? If we add some purpose to it and focus on these kinds of things, then our travels can become even more beneficial. Think of the education factor. Right? The Quran, for instance, it says in several verses, there are at least maybe 6 or 7 verses I can think of, where it says, Siru fil ard. Right? Travel in the land. فَانْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الْمُكَذِّبِينَ. And when you travel, then look with a special eye of kind of seeking admonishment. Look at what's happened to the people in the past who have turned away from Allah. When you go to ruins of civilizations, a lot of the hot tourist attractions are the ruins of past civilizations. Roman ruins and Greek ruins and ruins of this civilization and that, Aztec and Mayan ruins. Right? So we go to all these things, and we oftentimes the tour guide will focus on the kind of the culture itself, how great the civilization this was, how amazing this feat was that they were able to build this pyramid and that structure and this wall and all these things, which is fine. But there's a celebratory sort of a mood. But what the Quran wants us to focus on is not only those aspects, but more important is what went wrong that they're now ruins and they're not still standing. How did they live and how were they destroyed? What was it that led to their destruction? How can we avoid repeating that same mistake? So that our civilization now, as powerful as it might seem, right, in their days, they were superpowers. They seemed indestructible. They felt themselves to be indestructible, and the world also looked at them as being indestructible. But here they are as ruins. Right? So let's not just look at it with a sense of awe at their mastery of technology and their advancement in science, but also see that they obviously did something wrong. What was it? What was wrong with their civilization that they're now stories in textbooks, asatir al-awwaleen, as the Quran calls these people. Right? Simply legends left in writing, and not a real civilization anymore. Okay? Another verse says, "Siru fil ard fanzuru kayfa kana aqibatu alladhina min qabl." Just in the past in general, some were righteous. There were righteous civilizations as well. Maybe they flourished. To see what was right with them. What did they do right? That we can learn lessons from them as well. But that eye to education and learning from them is an important twist that we can give to our travels so they become meaningful. And it's not simply vacation and pleasure, but also something that we can get closer to Allah with. Another way to make our travels more meaningful, you've probably heard, there's a phrase now, voluntourism. Is that a familiar phrase to anyone? Hey, voluntourism. It's a play on, so volunteerism, but you can make your travels into something more meaningful. I know some organizations that are doing this. So for instance, there are needs in various parts of the world, even here locally in the US, but sometimes in other places, they need manpower. Similar to the spirit of Habitat for Humanity. Right? You have a need, you have people, lay people who don't necessarily have any skills, but they have muscle. They can lift, they can hammer, they can handle simple tasks like that. And so under the guidance of a trained architect, a trained construction manager, even lay people can turn into a construction machine and we can build a house. Right? So similarly, in a similar spirit, there are groups and companies out there that will help you to kind of go and serve, instead of just going for a vacation where it's all just receiving and pleasure and just that kind of a thing. Now you can go also enjoy, but also do something good for the people. So there's one group, for instance, that takes groups to Iraq and coordinates with certain villages that need wells dug. It's manpower. You need physical strength to go and do it, And so you can take your ziyarah group, you do your ziyarah, you do your activities that you want to do, but then you devote some time also to digging wells or building houses or fixing this and fixing that under the coordination of someone who knows what to do and how to do it. So now you're doing something meaningful, something good for people, helping them, and at the same time you also get to enjoy a new place. But the benefit that you get from hands-on helping people is so much greater than the benefit that you get from just giving sadaqah from a distance. That's something, if you haven't already realized that yourself, try it sometimes, right? Instead of only kind of giving your money as charity to organizations to handle it, where you never actually get in contact with the people who need it, try, if you can, in a dignified way, in a way that's very respectful, to get involved with the people who need it, right? Actually, do something with them in a way that you actually are in contact with them. You see how they live. You get involved with their lives in a way that you become a positive influence on them. But you also will realize that not only are you benefiting them, but oftentimes they'll benefit you in many ways that you never expected. In particular, helping poor people helps us to appreciate what we have, if we're not poor. Right, that's an important thing. There's guidance in hadith as well for that. When you're feeling down, sometimes we feel a little bit ungrateful. Sometimes we feel like we wish we had more. All you need to do is look at people who have less, and you'll realize how silly your thought was that I want more. There are people who have less, and sometimes they are even more grateful than we are for the much that we have. And so that's an important thing to do. The same spirit of visiting the sick. Sometimes we don't appreciate our health because it's so normal. It's only when we either feel the sickness ourselves, that's when we realize what a blessing health had been, or when we see other people who are suffering. So one of the wisdoms behind visiting the sick is, of course, for their comfort, for their kind of, to boost their spirits, but it also helps us as the well people to appreciate our health in a way that we otherwise wouldn't. All right, so these are some considerations when we're thinking about travel. One area I want to focus on a little bit is, what is the nature of the travel? There are two trips in particular that we have to take. And we need to be more serious in programming this into our vacation schedule. That one is Hajj, and the other is Ziyarah. We mustn't let it be that we kind of keep on pushing off and procrastinating about these two important kinds of travel. The emphasis that's there on Hajj in particular is huge. This is a duty. Oftentimes what I hear from people is they'll say, well, I'm not ready yet. Inshallah, when I'm ready, it's the same excuse that women will often bring for hijab. They'll say, I'm not ready yet, that's why I haven't worn hijab yet. I'm not ready yet, that's why I haven't gone for Hajj yet. Inshallah, 20 years down the road, when I'm ready, when I prepare myself, then I'll start following Allah's law and wear hijab, or I'll decide to go to Hajj. But right now, I'm not ready. And that's completely a false sort of idea. There's no such thing as not being ready for Hajj. If you have the money to go, then you're ready. If you have the money to go, there's certain other logistical conditions, but that's it. There's no spiritual... as soon as you're ready to go because you have the money now, you have the wherewithal to go, that's when you need to get in gear and learn what you're supposed to do and prepare yourself that way. It's not some lifelong kind of trip and somehow this is going to be the end of the whole journey, that as a culmination to my spiritual journey that I'm going to go for Hajj. No, not at all. Make this the first step. If you haven't been religious until now, go for Hajj and make this your kind of the first step towards becoming more conscientious about following Islam, Allah's laws, and living your life in a way that's more pleasing to Allah than it has been until now. Right? But the emphasis on Hajj is huge. To such an extent, we're told that once Hajj becomes wajib on you, right, meaning once you have the money to go, then it's written for you. Meaning it's now wajib on you until the end of your life. If you delay and procrastinate for this year, if you don't go this very year when you have the money in hand, even if you say in the future the economy crashes or your bank account empties and you don't have the money anymore, never in the future, for until the end of your life, you never have the money in hand again. You had it for these few months, you could have gone for Hajj, you passed it up, you didn't go, and now you don't have the money anymore. Too bad. It's still wajib on you. It remains wajib on you until the end. Because you had the opportunity, because you had the wealth to do it, you didn't do it. This stays with you, and this becomes a major sin, and a hadith is referred to as one of the mubiqat, one of the things that will destroy a person on the Day of Judgment. One of those major carnal sins, because of which everything else will be erased, and the person will be destroyed. So it's something really serious that we have to take into account and make sure that we don't belittle it or kind of procrastinate and put so many other trips as priorities before we go for Hajj. Right? وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. You owe Allah Hajj if you can. If you have the wherewithal to go, you owe it to Allah to do this. And you owe it to yourself because the benefit really returns to ourselves. And even if you can't go for Hajj, Umrah is wajib. Say you have the money, but logistically, one of the conditions is if it's such that, say, your living will take a huge hit. Right? That's one of the issues that's discussed in the books of fiqh, that say you'll lose your job, there's no way that you can maintain this job, and then once you lose that job, then maybe your record is going to be shot and nobody will hire you again. Basically your standard of living will go down if you take this trip for Hajj. Then in that situation, it's not required of you until you can arrange it. Right? But you still have to do Umrah. If you can't do Hajj, then Umrah Mufrada is wajib on you. And that's more flexible. It's not at a particular time of the year. Umrah can be any time. So certainly you can fit it in during a Christmas break or a summer break or some break for a week or so. You can take that trip and go. So that becomes wajib on you. It doesn't suffice you of your Hajj. You still have to go for Hajj when you can down the road. But at very least, this becomes an obligation. Similar is ziyarah. Right? Ziyarah should be something very, very serious that we put a lot of emphasis on. It shouldn't be something, again, such a kind of a last priority. After we've taken our other vacations and we traveled around the world and spent so much money on other trips, and then we keep on saying, oh, I don't have enough money for ziyarah, I don't have enough money for Hajj. There's a lot of emphasis on ziyarah meaning visiting the graves of these infallible guides, especially the Prophet and the 13 other Ma'sumin. Right? In particular, Imam Hussein. The emphasis, if you haven't looked at this book, there's a book, it's been translated recently into English as well, Kamil al-Ziyarat. Right? Kamil al-Ziyarat, this is a book, the whole book is a collection of ahadith divided into different categories, all about ziyarah. And a vast majority of those ahadith are about visiting Imam Hussein's grave in particular. So one of the ahadith, one of the categories of ahadith that's there are many ahadith that say this, is that if you procrastinate and delay, basically if you don't go for ziyarah, then your faith is not solid. Let me read one of the ahadith that comes like this. This is from Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
قال أبو عبد الله عليه السلام لو أن أحدكم حج دهره ثم لم يزل الحسين بن علي لكان تاركا حقا من حقوق الله وحقوق رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So the sixth Imam says that if someone were to even go for Hajj, right, showing this as an example, he's done something, everyone would say, mashallah, that's a very good thing he's done. He's gone for Hajj. In fact, he keeps on going for Hajj over and over again. Every year, every opportunity he has, he goes. ثُمَّ لَمْ يَزُرِ الْحُسَيْنِ, but he hasn't gone for a ziyarah of Imam Hussein. Then this person, he has abandoned one of the rights that Allah has on him, and one of the rights that the Prophet himself has on him. لأن حق الحسين عليه السلام فريضة من الله عز وجل واجبة على كل مسلم. Because doing ziyarah of Imam Hussein is an obligation to Allah that is obligatory on every believer. obligatory in these, it's not the same as the obligatory in the words of our mujtahids, but it's something extremely important, highly emphasized, to the extent that in some hadith they'll say, for instance, your faith is not solid. Some people were asking me about this. How do you make your faith solid? How can we make it so that in our graves, when Munkar and Nakir come and they ask us, Man Rabbuk, who is your Lord, that we won't hesitate, we'll say, Allah is my Lord. It's easy enough now, right? But it has to be something so solid in our hearts, so second nature to us, that it becomes part of us. That's when it's solid. That's when it'll carry over through past this life into our grave and into the Day of Judgment. When our actions, when we're no longer, like this, I think this is a good way to think about it. We shouldn't be content with just doing good. We need to aim at being good. It's easy to say the Shahada, but to actually believe the Shahada so it becomes part and parcel of you. That's the challenge. That's hard. It's easy to give charity, to do charity, but to become charitable, that's a challenge. Someone asks, I can dish out a couple of dollars. I've given charity. I did sadaqah. I gave sadaqah. But now to become one of the musaddiqeen, as mentioned in the Quran, one of the people who is a charitable person. I can pray, but what do I have to do to become one of the musalleen, one of the people whose habit is, in whose kind of flesh and blood prayer has been introduced. It's kind of mingled with his flesh and blood. That's the goal. So being Shia as well, it's very easy to say this and say that and pledge our allegiance to Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam in dua.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And to say Allahumma kulli waliyyak and all these du'as that we say, it's easy to say it. But we have to be worried. What about the people, the Jews, for instance, that came to Arabia, the Jews of Khaybar and Fadak? Why were they there in the first place? That wasn't their homeland. They came there because of the prophecies that said the last prophet's going to appear in Arabia. And so in intidhar, in awaiting of while they're awaiting the appearance of their savior, in the last prophet, they decided let's give up everything, let's go, and we'll be the first to, as soon as he rises up, we'll be there to support him and help him. That's why they're there. In Medina, why were there the Banu Nadir and Banu Qurayza and Banu Qaynuqa', all these 3 tribes that were there in Medina? They were there because of the prophecies. They were doing intidhar. We use the word intidhar for the 12th Imam, right? They were doing intidhar of the last prophet. But the Quran says that when that person who fulfilled the prophecies that they had been awaiting for so many centuries, when he finally appeared, not only did they not believe in him, they were the first to fight against him. The first to raise their swords against him, betray him. And very few of them actually believed. The Kufans also in a similar situation. Think of the fervor with which they wrote to Imam Hussein, the sheer number of letters, the kinds of words they were using to declare their loyalty to him and against his enemies. And then when it gets a little bit tough, they're the first ones to jump ship. And not only do they abandon him, they actually come out with their swords wielded against him, and they're the ones fighting against him and shooting arrows at him and eventually kill him. So we have to be extremely scared that just because we call ourselves Shia doesn't necessarily mean we are Shia. But one of the ways that we can make sure that this happens is by following through with these kinds of recommendations. Making sure that when we know something's wajib on us, we do it. When we know something's haram, we do our best to stay away from it. And every time we mess up, we turn back to Allah and say, I messed up. I ask for forgiveness, I'm going to try to do better. And then ziyarah Imam Hussein. That's one of the things that will solidify our faith. There's a famous hadith from the time of the 8th Imam, Imam Rida alayhi salam.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
You might have heard this hadith. So a group comes from Medina. This is the time when the Imam was in house arrest in Marw, in modern day Mashhad. And so a group of people from the Shia comes to visit him, and they come and they talk to the guard, and they say, you know, we'd like an audience with Ali ibn Musa al-Rida. Can you please ask for permission? So he goes in, he asks the Imam, and the Imam says, no, I don't give permission. And so the guard comes back and says, sorry, not today. So they go away. They come back again the next day, ask the same thing. Again, the same answer comes, no, you can't come. The third day when it happens, then they start to scratch their head and say, something's wrong. In 1 or 2 days, maybe the Imam was busy, but now it looks like there's some message behind this. He wouldn't refuse an audience with a Shia for 3 days like this. And so then they persist. They ask the guard. They say, you know, we really want to know if he's not going to see us. At least if he can tell us why. Then the Imam himself overhears. He comes out and he says, the reason why I don't want to see you is because you claim to be my Shia and you're not. You're out there making false claims that I'm the Shia of Ali ibn Musa al-Rida, and you're not. You have love for us. You're one of our muhibbeen. You have that sort of, you know, you kind of pay lip service. You have some sort of attachment to us, fine. But to be a Shi'i means you have to follow us. The literal definition of a Shi'i is a follower. Someone who belongs to the party, belongs to this particular group of people, who follows that leader. And so we have to ask ourselves as well, are we simply muhibbeen of the Ahlul Bayt, or are we Shia, at least aspiring Shia? And so one of the ways that we can do that again is by trying our best to in person go for ziyarah of Imam Hussein, especially on certain days. Arba'een is coming up, and Arba'een is one of the days, that's one of the alamat of a Shia, one of the signs. Right, there's that one famous hadith of the 11th Imam where he says that there are 5 signs of a Shi'i. Right, one of them is Ziyarat al-Arba'een. Or of course the day of Ashura. I know one of your community members, he just left for Iraq to go and be in Karbala during Ashura. Inshallah his ziyarah is successful and he comes back to you all safely. And then on the day of Arafah, right, after, of course, like you're performing your wajib hajj, you have to be at Arafah on the day of Arafah. You have to be at Arafat on the day of Arafah. But once that's finished, then the best place to be on the day of Arafah is where? In Karbala. The place where you have even more reward than being on the plain of Arafat is under the dome of Imam Hussein's grave. Yes, you'll see that's the day when millions upon millions of people come into Karbala to pay their respects to Imam Hussein. So that's something we should strive for. Let's not procrastinate with Hajj and with Ziyarah, especially of Imam Hussein, but all the Ma'sumeen. Many of them are in dangerous places now, but some of them are not. Anyway, and even if they are, that's another interesting. If you look at Kamil al-Ziyarat, you'll see there are many ahadith that talk about times that were even more dangerous than they are now, where people would ask the Imam, if we go there, they're basically guards put up by the Abbasids that block the path to Karbala. If we go, they'll either kill us or they'll maim us. And the Imam said, even then, go. People were maimed. Like the policy of some of these Abbasids would be to maim anyone who went for ziyarah to Karbala. And people would still go, and they would still be encouraged by the Imams to go. And there's a hadith there. Look in Kamil al-Ziyarat. Yeah, so if that was their policy at that time, then now is no less dangerous, no less scary to go. And so even if that's the case, go. Recite salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Alright, so just a quick recap and then I'll open up for questions. So we've been talking about decision making, trying to see what are some basic principles that we can have so that we can make decisions in a sound way. We know our goals, we know the law, and then we try to make our best decisions by consulting people, by researching, by making the best decision, benefiting from wisdom so that our decisions are in keeping with those goals and in keeping with those guidelines that Allah has put down. And then we looked at certain critical areas in our lives so that we can make better decisions in these areas, inshallah. Okay. Any questions on today's talk or even the last couple of talks?